Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. As always, I'm Alex here with Jake Hefner from Chargers Unleashed. Jake, how are you doing today?
Doing good, Alex. It has been way too long since the pessimist wonder twin powers have come together. So I always love these conversations with you. It's always great getting back together because, you know, our perspective is that I don't think get credited enough when it comes to the way that we look at things. A lot of people don't necessarily agree with them, but it's good in this circumstance. So
Are
you're
you
my
talking
people.
about Dan or who are you talking?
It can even go beyond that. I mean,
Yeah.
who knows?
Yeah. So I know I always love when we do this together. We always get together, once a year during the pre-draft show. But a lot of stuff has happened in this free agency period. I want to talk about something that happened last week that I was asleep for when it happened. Last Friday morning at 1 a.m., I woke up to 3 missed calls from Tyler, who had just done a live stream with Steven and Arjun. I had not commented on it last week, but yeah, the Keenan Allen trade happened with, late last Thursday night. I guess going into this and, the Hortiz press conference from yesterday and what Keenan's camp has said, what has kind of been your thoughts overlying this whole situation, starting from last week and maybe when you went through the whole 37 stages of grief in regards to the Keenan trade? Where do you kind of stand on it today?
I mean, yeah, you go through that initial shock moment that everybody went through, just because when we were talking about those big four contracts for months and months and months, the last one that we would have thought that would not be on this team would have been Keenan Allen, given the situation. And, you kind of went through some situations, or we just generally talked about it as far as whether it could be a restructure, you extend him a couple years, whatever it may ended up being. And I think it was from the more of the shock of it came was that the Chargers didn't necessarily have to do this because they were cap compliant. They'd already restructured Mack and Bosa, and coupled that with when everything happened, and now we hear the comments from both sides in terms of Keenan Allen had a fantastic 2023 season, was not looking to take a pay cut, and then obviously couple that with Hortiz's comments that there was a lot of options that were brought to the table, and ultimately when you look at it. And it was an unfortunate, yes. I don't think that anybody would have wanted to see Keenan Allen retire or, retire a Charger, not to see him have any other team name on his career history. But in the bigger picture of things, whether it was an extension, whether it was a pay cut, however anything could have possibly played out, Keenan Allen's time with the team was still going to be limited, even if he remained. And you had to start thinking about the new regime, the future, what was going to happen, because you have so many different changing aspects of this offense and defense and where the money needs to be put and what priorities need to be put on building out this roster around Justin Herbert. And you needed to start looking forward to that. So, yeah, ultimately why it's never a good thing to talk about Keenan Allen not in the powder blues anymore. From a business perspective, you can kind of understand why everything took place the way it did.
Yeah, it makes sense ultimately, and honestly, you read people like Brad Spielberger, and in terms of just looking at the trade itself isolated, they got pretty decent value in return for Keenan Allen with the 4th-round pick. I think the Texans offered a 3rd and then like a pick swap in return back, but that was about going to be the value for Keenan Allen, and clearly he came into this situation with the big 4 restructures with the highest value out of the 4 of them, and it was an interesting process for me because I just had never really considered a scenario where Keenan wouldn't be here. Mike gets cut, Joey and Mack restructure, and Hortiz even alluded to this in his press conference yesterday. There were like ideas to, do we keep 2 or do we keep 3, right? There were some like contingency plans kind of for, what might happen with Keenan. And so when Joey Bosa restructured, I was like, oh, well, they're just running it back with all 3 of them then. They're like, all right, well, here we go. And then obviously that happens later that Thursday. And so, yeah, I think from the standpoint of it was never going to be a long-term extension with Keenan. And you even look at what Mike Evans got in this free agency period with the Bucks, that's probably a number that Keenan and his team are shooting for, that, Joe Hortiz and this new regime probably weren't going to be comfortable with, as much as the focus has been, we don't want to push money into 2025. And there were ways that they could have lowered the first year cap hit for Keenan and done stuff like that. But I think ultimately this was a side where nobody really was wrong. I don't think Keenan was wrong not to take the pay cut for coming off of a 1,200-yard season. But I think both sides really understood their leverage in terms of the position they were in, right? And I think there will be a lot of fans who talk about it in the sense of, Bosa and Mac decided to take these pay cuts, and Keenan is not a team player in that aspect, but all of these guys, like I said, understand their market value and where they stand. And I think Keenan knew, hey, if I get traded somewhere else for a decently high day 3 pick, I can work out an extension with a team like Chicago, who is going to be paying Caleb Williams essentially a rookie contract. And I think that plays into it versus Joey Bosa right now. Has missed 20 plus games the last 2 seasons, and he knew his value into this cycle was not going to be as high. And I think if you hypothetically flip things and it's maybe Keenan who missed time and Bosa who had a 15 sack season, could we have seen the deck chairs and the musical chairs, go differently than they did, right? So ultimately, I don't think anyone was the bad guy. It sucks in the interim because this wide receiver room right now, I like Josh Palmer. He's good. And probably was on a 700, 800-yard pace last year had he been able to play the games, but, has racked up the concussions recently, battled through the knee injury last year. I think he's a great supplementary receiver to have in the room, but I don't know how long-term that is, that he is here on this team, right? With this new regime and Quentin Johnston, obviously the biggest wild card after, his first season and where this administration kind of sees his development going. So right. I wish something could have been worked out in the interim to kind of facilitate this new era, and whoever they're going to take in the draft, pairing that player with Keenan Allen would have been optimal, but I get why it didn't happen.
Yeah, it would have made things a hell of a lot easier when it came to draft time if you only had to subplant one wide receiver as opposed to 2.
Yeah, and now you get into the spot where it's I was thinking maybe 2 weeks ago, oh man, they have to draft 2 corners, but now they have to draft 2 wide receivers. So I think that is the tough part about where they kind of currently stand. I want to get into I guess past the restructures, some of the signings they've made. Obviously, they go after Gus Edwards, Will Dissly, bring back Alohi Gilman on a 2-year, $10 million deal. You have the Hayden Hurst contract, which is kind of a buy low thing, Poona Ford, Troy Dye, and then today they end up agreeing to Kristian Fulton to a 1-year deal. What are some of your thoughts on some of these, I guess lower money signings? Obviously not as complicated to work out as the big 4 restructures and how that played out. But how do you think maybe each of them kind of fit into the team here?
I mean, I think where they've put the nice allocation of their money thus far has been the wise thing to do, because one of the biggest issues that this team has had for years has been their depth, and it's been suffering when the Chargers have been so top heavy at certain positions, and then you have injuries take place, and the drop down in production from the starter to a second or a third string player is dramatic. So Gus Edwards seemingly was one of the worst kept secrets amongst players that we've possibly talked about as far as free agents targets goes. I like the idea of bringing him in. Obviously, the familiarity that he's had with the Ravens organization and being in a similar Harbaugh systems, the familiarity with the Greg Roman offense as well. I think that that's a good start for the running game. And in general, as far as that running back stable, that's not done yet, because Isaiah Spiller is still a question mark at this point in time. I think before the Gus Edwards trade, we may have been talking about, especially you, because I know where your running back rankings are. But as far as running backs in general, we could have been talking about running back at a much higher priority. It's not necessarily you forget about it now. You just bring the priority down a little bit. So you still need to fill out that depth at that roster spot. Obviously, with tight ends, bringing in Will Dissly, a blocking tight end that the Chargers have needed for years now. You lose Gerald Everett in free agency, which obviously I really liked the way that he played last year, especially yards after contact. I thought he had a very tough played year and showed what he was made of. The problem was he wasn't targeted enough to get those opportunities. So how do you move forward with that? So is Hayden Hurst now going to be your primary pass catching tight end to couple with Donald Parham? Let's not forget Donald Parham and Stone Smart are free agents after this year. So it probably takes you out of the Brock Bowers conversation. Do you prioritize tight end a little bit later in the draft? Do you go into this offseason with possibly 5 tight ends on your roster? I'm not so sure how that's going to look at, but you could tell where their priority was that they needed to fill that out. Kristian Fulton definitely needed some corner depth. Mike Davis gone. Jasir Taylor, Dean Leonard, huge question marks as it stands right now. Asante Samuel Jr., I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that he earns a second contract with this team. So as far as the secondary goes, there are a ton of questions to be answered. And Kristian Fulton is a guy who has obviously dealt with a number of injuries the last couple of years that has, unfortunately not brought the start of his career off to the best start, but 25 years old. He was coveted by a lot of teams, and we heard that by reports that he turned down numerous contracts with other teams, and still only at 25 for a 1-year flare deal that you could possibly see a resurgence from him in this Jesse Minter defense. I think is a very, very smart move by the Chargers. So low risk, possibly high reward, depending on how he plays. Maybe he ends up getting an extension after 2024. But in general, I like the moves that the Chargers have made to fill out certain needs of this roster. And in doing so, it's kind of showing their hand a little bit as to say, what they're going to be prioritizing in this draft at a higher mark, because wide receiver, obvious. Corner, you still need to prioritize that high. Interior defensive line, yeah, you need to get some bodies in there. So it'll be interesting to see where they target it, but you can kind of start piecing together of where those priorities are going to lie once we get to April.
Yeah, and I think one thing that also sticks out to me about some of the smaller signings we talked about, like Ford, Hurst, and Fulton, is that they're all in different ways kind of like reclamation projects on a 1-year deal, right? Puna Ford, obviously kind of fell out of the rotation in Buffalo last year, but they're hoping, hey, if he can, under this Binter defense, get his game back. The same conversation is kind of there with Kristian Fulton, who showed some potential in like his early seasons, but the production has fallen off more recently, but he still has the prototypical size at outside corner, and he's 25, like you said, to try it on kind of a minimum type deal. And the other thing is, yeah, you have Hayden Hurst, who had his struggles with concussions, post-traumatic amnesia last year, but he's still a guy that, as we saw, with the Ravens and with the Bengals, that can be a pretty dangerous pass-catching option. And I think that there's even a little bit more forward thinking here with Hortiz, which is, hey, like if all these guys or even some of them like hit for this team, they're productive in 2024. We can also let them walk in 2025. And then
loves those comp picks.
Yeah, loves the comp pick formula. So I also think that it is forward thinking in that sense as well. And I wouldn't mind, certainly with wide receiver. I think it was Daniel Popper of The Athletic who said that, Hortiz talked about adding free agents and, looking at the draft, particularly with wide receiver and corner. Wouldn't mind another body in the wide receiver room right now. And you do have, I think, guys like Michael Gallup and DJ Chark, who have both been in wide receiver rooms with Sanjay Lal, the new Chargers wide receivers coach. We'll see. They're both, I think, visiting the Ravens right now. But, we'll see where that kind of lands in terms of just adding bodies to this room. And I think that's the most important thing with these signings is, as you said, just kind of getting bulk at these positions. So then you don't have to be pigeonholed into drafting certain positions or, prioritizing need over best player available. And I think the Hortiz mantra is ultimately to go with best player available, kind of regardless of the position. And that is optimally what the Chargers want to do, but not really what they can do right now. And I think the goal is to ultimately get there by getting some of these, smaller signings. Obviously, I think bringing Gilman back is great. We've kind of talked about it, but he obviously had a great year last year. Ended up being a little bit more player friendly than, I think a lot of people anticipated. But his pairing with Derwin James, I think still, it's worth keeping that together, much like it's worth, trying Mack and Bosa one more time in the same vein and not opening up more holes along this defense. So I was ultimately fine with that signing. And then finally, we have a Rutgers player who plays for the Chargers, so I was very excited about
Very happy about that.
about the Gus Edwards signing. So, but yeah, I ultimately don't think it precludes them in the draft from going running back. I do ultimately expect them to take someone, regardless of who it is. Obviously, Jim Harbaugh is at the Michigan Pro Day right now. Could that be Blake Corum? Much to my chagrin, it could be.
Was that a nice transition also mentioning a Rutgers player? Is it foreshadowing that there could be a certain other Rutgers player that could be joining this team in just a little over a month?
I would hope so. I would hope so. Clink Scale was doing drills at the combine with Max Melton and all the other DBs. So I would love to. I would love if Max Melton was on this team.
Have to acknowledge the president of the Max Melton fan club. Obviously, have to do that.
It's funny. I went back into me, Steven, and Tyler's 2022 draft rankings this week, and I thought it was actually shocking that Steven had Bo Melton as a top 50 player in that class, and I did not. It's just one of the more shocking things I had seen. But yeah, Max would be a great fit on this team. I'm sure they'll also look at Mikey Sanders still at this Michigan Pro Day as well. He, would be a tremendous fit, I think, in the second or third round, just playing, is the optimal Minter player, and slot corners are more valuable than they've ever been, as we've kind of seen with the Chargers in recent years, and some of the deficiencies of that position, and not necessarily having that elite slot corner guy outside of maybe the year that they had like Bryce Callahan, who was pretty good. So yeah, I definitely think that position also needs an investment as well. Getting into broader things here. All right. When it comes to pick 5, what team are you on? Are you stick and pick at 5, whether that's Marvin Harrison Jr., Neighbors, Joe Alt, much to the chagrin of some people? You could go with any player you want at 5, or are you on team trade back? And I guess, has that changed, before and after this free agency period as well?
Yeah, I think it has altered it a little bit when you see some of these, holes being filled in free agency. But for the past 10 years, I've been on team trade down. And this is where the football gods are a fickle bunch that, of course, when it's a situation that the Chargers are sitting at 5 and the possibility of Marvin Harrison Jr. falling into their lap, that this is the time where you're going to have me not want to trade back. It's just like, curse you. But no, I think that the Chargers are in just a very good spot in general, whichever way that they choose to go. They really haven't been in a position like this in the last decade. And from a standpoint of what we already know that Joe Hortiz wants to do, you couple that with what Jim Harbaugh is obviously going to prioritize, because as we've seen, he's going to have the ear of a lot of his assistant coaches when it comes to prioritizing these players in this draft. So obviously, he's going to be listening to Jesse Minter in terms of what they need defensively. The Kristian Fulton signing does not deter the Chargers spending a high priority on a cornerback. I could see that as a possibility if the Chargers were to hypothetically trade back from 5 to 11 and you prioritize corner with the 11th overall pick, whether it be a Terrion Arnold or a Quinyon Mitchell, or if you choose to wait on that with your pick 37. I think both situations are ideal if that's how you're targeting a cornerback. Now, I get what everybody's saying in terms of if you move out of the top 10, you're most likely going to lose out on any of the top big 3 receivers. And yes, I 100% agree with that. So then where does it become the priority, especially because now you're in a position where you, at least as of now, need not 1, but 2 wide receivers really to fill out this offense. So how do you prioritize it? Well, if Marvin Harrison Jr. is still there at 5, the case to trade down, I have to tear it up and just throw it out the window, because you shouldn't even be in a position to get Marvin Harrison Jr. in general. And especially after the season ended with Arizona, that really put a lot of us all in just a hissy fit and took us out of that potential 4th spot to get him. Now, if he falls to you at 5, screw the trade down plan. You take arguably the best player in the entire draft and you go Marvin Harrison Jr., no questions asked.
Yeah, it's always interesting following, the smoke that comes out every year, particularly about the quarterbacks. And I wasn't really a believer in like the JJ McCarthy is going to go top 5 stuff until recently, where like now it's become this universal truth that, McCarthy is going in that top 5 and some team is going to trade up for him. That also makes me suspicious of how much of this is real. So I still like am unsure what to believe there. But yeah, as you said, if Marvin Harrison Jr. is there, and all respect to Dan, I know he's a Neighbors guy. You take Marvin Harrison Jr. And I think that you, especially in a post Keenan Allen, world, I
Yes.
think which receiver you would optimally pair with Keenan would be a little bit different if he was still here. And I think Keenan would also alleviate the pressure a little bit of like not necessarily having to go receiver at 5, and maybe you trade back and get 11 and 23 and you take Adonai Mitchell or something like that. But now you're in this position where I do think they've kind of been forced into taking one of these guys, which is, I mean, it's a great thing to be forced into, whether it ends up being Marv, Neighbors, or Odunze. But I was kind of more pro trade back prior to this Keenan Allen trade,
Same here.
especially where they've recouped a 4th-round pick. Some people will say that, again, the math of the situation still would say you're getting this draft value and extra players if you do trade back, which I get, and maybe there's a possibility that they can even get a future 1st-round pick next year if they trade back a certain amount of spots. I like Terrion Arnold a lot as a cornerback who could set up for this defense for a long time, and I think it would be a great fit with somebody like Clinkscale, Jesse Minter. I think would have a lot of fun with Terrion Arnold too. But now I do think they're at the point where, with the Keenan Allen trade, I think you do kind of have to ultimately go wide receiver at 5. Maybe they can trade back a couple spots if they, say, for example, don't have like the biggest grade difference between Marv, Neighbors, and Odunze, and like trade back, get some extra capital, and then take like whoever is left of the 3 at 9. That's also a potential option. I think Jordan Reed, one of his recent mock drafts, had the Chargers trading down with the Bears,
Yes.
and the Bears trading up for a receiver. I don't total. I think the Chargers took Bowers in that mock,
They did.
but they could also kind of trade back to 9 and then say, okay, well, we can take whoever is kind of, the worst of the 3 receivers. All of them are studs. Get some extra draft capital back in that way as well. So, I think there's a lot of options for what they can do. And like you said, they're in a great position, but I would feel an awful lot more confident about this receiver room if it ultimately is one of those 3 guys, particularly Marvin Neighbors. And then you can kind of build out your receiver room from there. Even if you don't go get another receiver in the draft, you can sign somebody maybe who's a cap casualty after the draft, sign somebody who's kind of available right now in terms of like a Josh Reynolds or a Tyler Boyd or Michael Gallup, Odell, right? So they can kind of, facilitate that. But right now, it is weird to be like, yeah, trade down, trade down, trade down. Okay, but not this year.
Right.
like
That's the
you
exception
said,
to the rule.
yeah, it is the exception to the rule. And my response to that would also be like, man, the roster doings of Tom Telesco are not going to talk me out of Marvin Harrison. I'm not paying the Telesco tax and missing out on
Telesco
generational
tax.
prospect. I'm not paying the tax and then, letting it affect how we currently build the roster, which I also think they view as more of a 2-year roster retool rebuild than it is a 1-year anyway. But yeah, no, I think that is kind of my thought on the draft right now. Going into, this free agency, are there any guys maybe in the later rounds that you've liked as potential fits for the Chargers that maybe have gone up after free agency with their, position needs now?
You could look at center because I know that
Mm,
everybody's been wanting JPJ, and I totally get it.
right.
I'm a huge fan of Zach Frazier's, but the signing of Bradley Bozeman, how much of a priority does that take away from where you're going to prioritize it? Again, we just went through the wide receiver needs. We talked about their needs at corner. You can even look at linebacker right now, considering that Denzel Perryman and Dye are only on 1-year deals. we didn't really get to see that much of Deion Henley last year. And what you really need, especially in Minter's defense, is a linebacker who can bring a lot in the coverage standpoint. So where are you going to prioritize that position? I think center is one that's really now in flux. And
Mhm.
I like Steven and bullish actually on this center class. I like what I see from this center class. So whether it's the JPJ or the Fraziers that you end up ultimately passing on, Cedric Van Pran, you get it a little bit later, maybe someone even a little bit more familiar with Michigan and Drake Nugent that Harbaugh would be familiar with. I think you still, obviously, this is just a stopgap situation with Bradley Bozeman. You have to find your center of the future for the next 5 to 8 years for Justin Herbert's career, and especially in this new regime for what Greg Roman wants to run. So I think the center position is one that is a lot in flux as far as like, okay, where are they actually going to look to target that now that Bozeman's on the roster?
Yeah, that one's going to be interesting because I think there is an argument that you don't have to address it immediately. But also Bozeman is a center that is 30 years old and is coming off of, granted it was Carolina, bit of a different scheme for him to adjust to relative to the ones that he was kind of in with Greg Roman. And I think the thought is that some of his pass blocking deficiencies in a year where he gave up, I think, 32 pressures and 8 sacks, which were career highs, can be a little bit mitigated by being in a scheme that more fits himself. And obviously the familiarity there with Roman and Hortiz helps a lot. So I do think they're kind of banking on that. But I also, after that signing, still think they should be aggressive. Like if Zach Frazier's there in the second round and he's the best value and he's the best player available, like I don't know if it's a conversation really. Obviously, there's a bunch of quarters you can go for there, and depending on what they do in the first round, wide receivers, etc. But he is 1A, 1B with me when it comes to Jackson
Same.
Powers Johnson. I think that he is a real stud prospect, and then you start sliding into the later rounds. You got like Bo Limmer out of Arkansas who tested like a freak, tested well.
Yes.
And I know Steven's guy that he's kind of like honed in on is Hunter Norzad out of Penn State. He's a guy that I think is going to make potentially a lot of sense. Like if you want a guy to sit for a year, sit behind Bozeman, and then maybe again going back to the comp pick game, let Bozeman walk for comp sometime this offseason and then start Norzad next year, right? Like that's also kind of a possibility, and also how teams like the Eagles have operated with interior offensive line and sort of, building that out over the years and utilizing both free agency and the draft. So I could also see something like that happening. I definitely think that has the greatest range. Linebacker to some extent too, because I think, the pick that makes the most sense to me when I think about linebackers, obviously Junior Colson,
Yes.
who I think not only would be a good fit with Denzel Perriman, but also make up for a lot of his pass coverage deficiencies at the stage of his career. This is a 33-year-old, Denzel Perriman, not what he was in 2024 years ago when he ultimately left. So I do think you kind of, in addition to Dion playing more and the Chargers getting younger at that position in general, he's also kind of a name that I look at. There will be Jeremiah Trotter Jr., a lot of, potential linebackers that they can take kind of in that range. But that's also a position that, well, if you don't take a guy in that like second, third round, then like I don't know if the value is like quite as strong going down the board. So yeah, that'll be an interesting position, I think, to watch too. Is there any specific day 3 draft prospect that is like your crush right now?
It's interesting because again, this is what free agency does to
Yeah.
you. Because where were you going to prioritize the running backs before Gus Edwards was a part of this team?
Yeah.
Maybe you would have prioritized it in round 3. Now you start looking into day 3 in general. And the good thing about this is, as it relates to, I know it's not the best running back class when you're looking at, one of the more elite type of prospects. There's no Bijan in this type of draft,
Mhm.
and the consensus around who is the number one guy is kind of all over the board as it relates to this running back class. But the good thing about this is that Greg Roman runs so many different run concepts
Mhm.
that there's a variety of skill sets with guys that are in the later rounds that you could totally look to say, hey, running back by committee, we can make this work. I was disappointed to see Audric Estime's combine. I was happier to see what he did at the pro day to elevate his timing a little bit, because immediately you just thought like, oh my God, this is going to be a short yardage back now at the next level. What is that going to look like? I really like Ray Davis out of Kentucky. I really like what
Love him
he's
too.
brought to the table. You look at a couple other guys, just kind of just going through my head. I really liked oh my gosh, why am I forgetting his last name? Isaiah, help me out here. South Dakota.
Oh, Davis?
Thank you. Yes. I really liked Isaiah Davis, just the way that he runs. I mean, he gives a Derrick Henry stiff arm that, he would just be standing up on the sideline and totally applauding for. So, in terms of what are you going to create in this running back stable between Edwards, Spiller, and fill in RB2, RB3, it'll be interesting to see. But I don't think that the Chargers are going to have a lack of options when it comes to day 3 guys. And I think running back, we've talked about so much over these last few years in terms of what Tom Telesco was shooting for when he was drafting day 3 running backs. And unfortunately, those didn't end up panning out. I think you can find a better combination of guys with a more versatile skill set in this particular class.
I, during the Tom Telesco era, had to take several walks outside during the draft to calm myself down. Because in 2021, Khalil Herbert's 130 on the consensus board. Larry Roundtree is 234. Who are we going to take over who? Okay. All right. I'm going to go take a walk and calm myself down. 2022, Jerome Ford was my running back 1. Isaiah Spiller was my running back 6 or 7. Went in the wrong direction there, in my opinion.
Gotta love it.
2023, thankfully, we were saved from any potential running back pick happening under the Telesco era there. Bet on Spiller and traits. Didn't really work out. Now that we are here, I hope I would be willing to sit down with Hortiz and talk about my day 3 preferences if he has time to sit down. But, I think at this stage, it'll be interesting to see what skill set they target, like you said, because I think you look at some of the, Blake Corum, for example, right? Like his best skill set to me is the short yardage game. His vision, particularly like in red zone situations. And in theory, that makes sense. But you also just got Gus Edwards to do that, right? And he's supposed to kind of be your short yardage red zone guy. Not saying that prevents, they're very different running backs in a sense of 1.61, 240. One is shorter than Tyler, as he said on the podcast yesterday. So, I think you can look at it from that way. But I also do think they kind of need a little bit more speed in the running back room. Like if you are kind of going to go with somebody like a Gus Edwards as your running back 1/running back 2, depending on how early they take one. I love Kamani Vidal out of Troy. I've talked a lot about him, but it meets all like the GPS requirements. He's a freak, yards after contact, breaks tackles. I think he would be a lot of fun to have in this system. And Ray Davis, like you said, I'm a little iffy about drafting running backs who are as old as me, child of 99, Ray Davis. But I do think that he is just awesome to watch on tape. So I would love to see him come into the fold too. So Jake, thanks for coming on the show with me today. Any final Chargers thoughts or anything else you want to end the show with after these last crazy 2 weeks of free agency?
I mean, this is the best time of year for all of us as it relates to just getting on here and talking about the NFL draft. There's just
I'm
so
a little,
much to cover.
Even with the Keenan trade, I am way happier than doing a podcast during the 2023 season.
Yes, 100%. I think it's under the umbrella of everything that has changed, because it's like if we were still talking about an old regime and Keenan's no longer on this roster, you may feel a little bit differently. But now the fact that Joe Hortiz and Jim Harbaugh are now at the controls, it does feel a little bit better. There's really a lot of excitement to still be had as it relates to gearing up to the 2024 season. I think all of those notions about worrying about the 3rd round pick in the draft may be fully dispelled after this year, which would be a relief. Nobody has to hold their breath in the 3rd round anymore, which is kind of nice. But I'm really happy to see how they go about with their draft strategy, how they ultimately end up finishing this roster. And as Joe Hortiz said, one of the final things in his interviews was that the roster building is never done. So whether that's after training camp, right before the beginning of the season, whether it's in season, you can totally tell that now there is a GM in power that is going to make moves to better this team, whether it's for the short term or the long term. And that should really have everybody excited about what this new regime has in store. So, plenty to be excited about over the last couple of weeks, even more to be excited about over the next couple of months. And let's go.
Yeah, let's pray that we can avoid the third round reach, so I don't have to defend a JT Woods pick on the live stream.
You
You
may be
never
having
know.
to take another walk. Hopefully, that's not the case.
We'll see which running back they draft. I trust the quorum appeal might be a little too much for them, but I trust Jim Harbaugh and Joe Hortiz at the end of the day. Jake, thanks for joining me, and as always, everyone, bolt up.